individuals can't change systems in the way teams can. You can have a high-performing team that ultimately undermines the entire system.
The organization goals sometimes takes over the team setup.
For this company to thrive now and in the future, what does that look like?
Management is just chasing the next promotion. So as long as I get my stuff done and I can move up in the organization, I don't really care about anything else. Don't you want to be proud of what you leave behind?
Do you respect me for what I do, or do you respect me for the role I have and my position in the organization?
Thanks for joining us on the second episode of this 3-part series. If you haven't watched the first episode, please check it out when you get the chance. If you've already seen it, thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate it. In this episode, we're going to talk about the characteristics of a high-performing team, and we'll cover some of the conflicts we can experience in an organization. You may have witnessed colleagues looking for those quick win solutions rather than those sustainable ones, or they throw people under the bus so that they can get a promotion. Are the right systems in place to get us aligned with the vision and purpose? We're going to discuss all of these topics. Let's get into it.
So let's move on from the education system to the workplace. So I want to touch on high-performing teams within the workplace. In your mind, what do you define as a high-performing team or high performance?
I think I will always say it's contextual. So it depends what's going on in the system at the time. I think in terms of high performance comes about when there's the match between the capabilities of the team and individuals to the needs of the system that they're trying to engage with. Within high-performing teams, I think the biggest thing is trust. So how do I know that I can trust my other team members is fundamental. So how interconnected and how interdependent we are is what I think is really important to high-performing teams. So you can have the rock star or the player who's like, I'm the best at this, but you can't be the best at it unless you have a team around you. Because what happens is individuals can't change systems in the way teams can. And so again, it goes back to how do you ultimately foster trust in your teams to be able to do that? And what are the conditions of trust that are created through leadership, through management, and through the culture of the organization?
Yeah. And what are some of those things that organizations can implement to increase that trust?
Well, I think in terms of trust, you always start with what's the vision? What is it we want to achieve together? Are people signing up to that? And I think this goes back to the point earlier we discussed, which was if I'm here to just get my paycheck because I'm here for purpose, you're going to have a contradiction within your system there, because some people are just there to extract, whereas other people are passionately believing that we're going to change something if we do this. And so having that kind of alignment of vision and values is really, really important. And I think that often gets tested most when organizations are under pressure. And that pressure can be internal, which is we're creating a whole set of measures and targets that you can't actually see how it aligns with the vision. Or it can be an external pressure, which is we've got competitors moving, so we need to move. But does that still align with our vision, or are we responding to our competitors? So I think that is where leadership really does need to constantly monitor for us to trust in the vision and trust in each other, what is happening both internally and externally, and how does that influence the culture of the organization? Because what you end up with, and there's always this big risk in organizations, is people become siloed. You then get tribal behavior. So as long as my bit of the organization is fine, don't care about the rest. So you can have a high-performing team that ultimately undermines the entire system because everyone's now playing to win in their patch rather than does this help the entire organization?
Yeah, because sometimes there's an imbalance between the organizational goals because they have KPIs and certain metrics that you have to meet versus creating that team autonomy. And sometimes the two conflict with each other. Also, when it comes to innovation, right? Like all of these companies want to be innovative, but I think sometimes the finances speak for themselves and they just want the end result and they don't think about setting it up correctly? What are your views on that, where certain things conflict with each other, so the organization goals sometimes takes over the team setup or environment,
I think,
which could hurt the financials in the future?
so I think there's always conflict in organizations and in systems, and it's how that conflict gets articulated, gets engaged with, and ultimately gets resolved. And so you will have these tensions of needs between various functions and teams within organizations. But if we trust each other, then we trust each other enough to express those needs and find a solution. Whereas what tends to happen is if the culture is very much around competition, then what you get is hoarding behavior. And then you also get the weaponization of things against like each other in the system. So the organization's overall value, benefit, and productivity declines because it's spending too much time internally fighting itself rather than saying, well, what's the overarching benefit we could achieve? And I think there is from a systems perspective, there is a misunderstanding about what benefit looks like. So if we're going back to our short-termism versus sustainability and long-term. So for this company to thrive now and in the future, what does that look like? But if we're only interested in quarterly returns, your time horizon is so short now that you're probably starting to kill your sustainability, because as long as we achieve the next 3 months goal, we no longer think about long-term planning, long-term resources, and what we need to have a culture of trust, because we've made everything so short-term. That urgency creeps back in, like, I need to achieve something now. And then you lose value in the overarching organization. And that means that probably the vision is being lost as well.
Yeah. I see this happening a lot where management is just chasing the next promotion. So as long as I get my stuff done and I can move up in the organization, I don't really care about anything else. And it's that short-term thinking mindset that you mentioned that isn't really focused on like longevity, sustainability, and even legacy, right? So sometimes I witness this happening. I'm thinking, don't you want to be proud of what you leave behind? Because for me, I think that's one of my main purpose in life is to leave a legacy so that people can look back and say, this is what this person achieved, and he paved the way for future generations to move on and thrive and get even better. But in some organizations, I see that they don't have that mindset. It is that quick win mindset, and they can benefit from it, but it's not benefiting everyone or the entire organization. And the same thing in society.
Yeah, I think there is something in what you're saying, which is around hierarchy. So hierarchy creates winners and losers to some extent. It also then introduces this idea of power. So like, do you respect me for what I do, or do you respect me for the role I have and my position in the organization? And so some people are there just to try and increase their position in the organization. And so their decisions and their actions reflect that. And the danger is that in doing so, you don't bring people with you. And so you create even more conflict in the system. And this is where other leaders have to say, well, are we still reflecting the vision and values? And are we promoting people on their ability to bring benefit based off of their vision and values, rather than their ability to maneuver others into positions of power? And so I think there is a challenge when you look at it from a systems perspective, which is like, if that's what's happening in your system, then what are the conditions that allow that to keep replaying itself? So simply changing like the CEO of an organization does not change the culture. And in some ways, the CEO can be forced to adapt to the culture of the organization, regardless of their own like independent identity. And so this is again where I would argue, you come back to the systems bit and going, how does the system enable people to behave this way? And how as leaders do we engage with that system to create the sustainability, the longevity, and ultimately the benefits we want by being a collective organization together?
Yeah. I think it's more thinking of it from a bottom-up approach rather than top-down. I think it's all about the people all being aligned with that vision, because like you mentioned, someone could be a horrible manager and the people don't go with them or don't support them. But the issue is that they then move on to another role, another manager comes in, and it's that chaotic cycle where, okay, that person's moved on now I'm getting a new manager. Oh, this new manager is the same as the old one, which starts to come to light after a few months in the role. He then gets a promotion, and then it's just a cycle where people get rewarded not necessarily for building that team, especially if you're in a big organization. I think a lot of that goes under the carpet.
And I think in what you're saying there's a success criteria that the system is valuing. And so therefore, I don't need to be here long. I just need to achieve this and I can get promoted. And the disruption to the people who actually have to deliver is where that's not being seen. So one of the things that I talked about in my book was part of understanding systems is no action is a form of action. So if that doesn't change, that success criteria is the success criteria by which you need to succeed, because no one's calling it out. No one's saying the people who have to be part of that team for that leader are really unhappy. They're not actually achieving anything because they're just a stepping stone to the next thing to come. So one of the hardest things I think for leadership is to recognize when there is an inactivity in the system, because most people are trained to look for a problem that is like flashing red light on the risk register, for example, or there's like a really disruptive group of people. But if you have a team, for example, that are just opting out very quietly, not engaging, that inaction is telling you a lot. But often leaders aren't trained to look for inaction as much as they are action.
I think in your book you call it like organizational blindness, where some of those people just have their blinders on and they're just focused on what they need to get done, and they kind of forget everything surrounding them. So they're just oblivious to what's actually happening.
And it's natural. Like, we acclimatize to any type of culture. And so you will stop seeing things. Like, I'm always interested in probably the people who are newest into an organization, because they have the freshest eyes to be able to call stuff out. Whereas, when someone goes, well, I've got 20 years experience here. Well, that tells me you probably miss a lot because you are so acclimatized to the culture. And so there is this thing about this, both individual blindness, but organizational blindness is where everyone stops seeing it because it's just part of the culture. So you could have a particular type of incident that happens, like a health and safety one that everyone ignores because no one really cares about it, kind of thing. But you become acclimatized to that feature of not seeing that health and safety risk, for example. That becomes organizational blindness. And then somebody else walks along one day and goes like, why hasn't anyone put any tape around that? Because they see it for the first time. And so again, it's about recognizing how systems can co-opt mindsets over time.
Yeah, there's been many situations that I've been aware the response from people has been, it's just the way it is, instead of questioning why is it the way it is.
So there's this definition of culture, which is culture is the way things get done around here. It's very simplistic, but it's also very dangerous in the sense that A, we accept whatever is happening in the system, in the organization as is. B, we don't look for inaction in the system because we're only interested in what gets done around here. And I think the final point would be that actually for new eyes, how do I engage with stuff if the traditions and the rituals of the organization can't be challenged?
Yeah. And I read this study, I think it was a Gallup study, that 50% of employees leave because of their managers. And I think maybe there's people in leadership positions that should not be in leadership positions because they don't assess all the qualities of a leader. Like, what are your thoughts on that and the detriment it has to organizations?
I think, again, always context matters.
Yeah.
So I can only lead if the conditions of the system allow me to. And so sometimes it doesn't matter what I personally believe. If this is what the success criteria to stay in that position is, it means I might be making decisions that fundamentally go against my own values and beliefs. But to be perceived to be successful, I enact that role. So I'm always much more interested in context than the person.
Yep.
And I think within what we're saying here, there's this bit around, well, if people are leaving, then that's a sign that something is wrong in the system. And it's really interesting that how then do we justify the narrative of people leaving? Like, oh, they probably weren't good enough. They weren't the right fit. But again, we're no longer looking at what are the conditions that make people leave our organization. We tend to put it into, well, it's that individual. And that's the risk of component thinking. I'm looking at the problem as a cog in my machine, as opposed to, well, what are the conditions in an ecosystem that make it very hard for someone to stay? And that can be around a whole range of things, whether we're looking at, race, gender, sexuality, ability. There's like those types of aspects, but then there's the conflict types of aspect. Do I want to be in an organization where people are always making power plays to either stay in their position or move up? That's really tiring. If I want to do a job which I think can bring value to the world, but then I've got to watch who's behaving in what way for what reason, you're now making a really heavy cognitive load, i.e. taking up too much of my brain power for me to really enjoy the thing that I'm here to do.
Yeah. And how can leaders use systems thinking to potentially balance their personal ambitions with the ambitions of the organization and their team members?
Oh, that is a good question. I think it's about understanding what you want your organization to be in the future. And that breaks you out of the short-termism. So I'll give an example. I was doing a really interesting piece of work last year in the NHS, and a lot of the challenges were about like, what do we need to do over the next 18 months? So I said, like, let's forget about the next 18 months and look at what do we want our service to be like in 2035. And like the timescale was just like blew people's minds. Like, that's just 10 years down the road. What? And what it does is it then gives you a creative freedom to kind of imagine again. Rather than think about deliverables, we start to become creative. We start to go, right, actually, how could we draw on things like AI for a health benefit? How can we create much more bespoke health responses to particular types of needs? And it freed people up, actually. And I found it really interesting that there was just suddenly this wave of creativity happening in the conversation because the time frame had changed. So if you're thinking about your question around what can leaders do to align with the business or the organization, it's about saying over what time frame are we thinking about the change? And I remember talking to one CEO and he goes, when I'm thinking about systems, I'm thinking about two things. What's the sustainability that I want to leave behind? So I recognize that if the system is thriving, it doesn't need me to thrive. And so it's not about my personal victory. It's about me enhancing the entire organization. And because of that, then I feel like I've left a genuine legacy. Like I've made the organization of the community better than when I left it. And those people can now have their creativity in that next step rather than having to deal with, the present constant short-termism.
Yeah. And as an individual, maybe entering the workplace or entering a new role, how can you use systems thinking to prosper as a new person entering, like understanding stakeholders or the vision, etc.? If you were going into a new role, what are the first things that you would try to gauge that will help you understand what's happening and how you can navigate your career in that role?
I think listening is crucial, like getting constant information of what's happening. So sometimes people go into a new organization, go like, I've got to prove myself in some way. And you stop being sensitive to what's going on around you, particularly, as I said, if you've got fresh eyes. Taking in that information allows you to see things that others can't. And there's a value in that you can articulate. And I think the second thing is about what are the interconnections that are missed as well? Like, because you're starting that organization from onboarding, meeting the team, you probably got the best view at that moment in time around, well, what isn't happening here that could be happening? Because other people have already accepted that. We've gone back to our organizational or individual blindness. So yeah. I think the two things of listening, because you can engage with more people when they feel that you're listening to them, and looking for those interconnections would be really valuable, particularly when you're starting the world of work, because it can all feel so overwhelming. But there is a value to having those fresh eyes that I think employers and leaders need to value a lot more.
And then how about understanding some of your stakeholders and like what influences them and how you can contribute?
I think with stakeholder engagement, there's, Arnstein's ladder of participation, which I think is absolutely brilliant model of when are people allowed to participate. And you can have like really tokenistic forms of participation all the way into like true, authentic participation. So when we're thinking about engaging with stakeholders, what is the way in which we're honoring their voice, making sure their voice is heard, and how those voices are then used in a way to generate actions in the system? I think a lot of people get a lot of fatigue from participation because you just don't see where it's going. Like, click on this, we'll ask you like 3 questions, text you. But what change does that bring about? Like, you've taken my voice, but how, like, have you fed back that mattered in some way? So I think for me, the feedback loop there is really crucial, which is if you're going to ask someone to participate and share their worldview, their lived experience, well, then have the courtesy to say, this is what changed because you did that.
Yeah. You talk about feedback, and I think that's definitely an area that can be improved in the corporate world, because we tend to have like 6-month reviews and 12-month reviews, and that's really the only time we give feedback to our management. How can that process be improved where, first of all, there's more feedback loops over the course of the year, but also being able to implement change and get your voice heard over that period? Because sometimes it's a surprise to people or management when they get poor scores and they have that individual blindness, or they're oblivious to how their team members actually feel. Are there any best practices for feedback that you can recommend, both for management and for individuals?
Well, I think it's not just about the feedback, it's about what are the spaces for what types of conversation. So if everything's very functional, deliver kind of thing, that's all I might know about you. So I'm judging you based off of like your deliverability. But where are the opportunities to have conversations about, right, we've got this type of conflict happening with like our customers or our clients. How can we explore that space together? Again, it goes back to where's the opportunity for creativity, because that will lead to innovation. And seeing how much people come alive in those spaces always fascinates me, to be honest. Like, people, you kind of think, they're very much like laser focused. Suddenly give them the right question and the right space to answer that question, and you get a totally different perspective on who they are and what they're about. So I think the danger is like exactly what you just said, which is I'm only going to rate you based on what I see you do. Doesn't tell me about your interconnection or what's interdependent to you. So we're back to treating the person like a cog. And so I think there is a bit in there which is around how do we create creative spaces for conversation that aren't necessarily focused on today's task, but where we want to be as a team. Also, how do we deal with conflict as well? Like, it's so intrinsic to human relationships that we're going to get into conflict at various points. And are we being passive aggressive? Is someone being aggressive? Like, understanding people's responses to conflict will also give me a better understanding of what the relationship could be like them. And again, are they like that in that situation as well? So like someone who's like always aggressive in meetings, go to like the company lunch or something, and you see a totally different, and like that shocks people often, because you now got to juxtapose who I thought they were here with who they are in this situation. So the more opportunities we can have, diversity of experiences as a team, the more likely we are to find those moments of creativity and improve performance. I think the danger is that, just 2 points in the year where I'm going to talk about, who you are. Think about how much you achieve in a day or a week. Like, how does that get all condensed into some kind of scoring metric? And, what value is being placed on you when that happens?
Yeah. And sometimes I've noticed the values of the company can contradict these feedback mechanisms, because your company could have the value of like honesty and integrity, but then sometimes you could speak up but get punished for speaking up because it doesn't align to their way of thinking, or people don't like hearing the truth. The truth hurts. So I see that potentially being an issue as well, where they talk about open feedback and we can hear you, we'll implement these changes, but if it doesn't fit their narrative, and then you could get looked down upon for speaking the truth or get treated differently because you spoke your mind.
Yeah, there's so much in that. So firstly, there's like what are the values? How does culture enhance or distort those values? And then what does that mean for the individual? So we might want honesty, but I know to play the game well, I just need to tell you just enough to keep you happy, but not how bad the project is going, for example, kind of thing, because that's just too much honesty. And then the other part of that is as well, like, what's the gamification that happens? So like, I can weaponize my values against you. Well, you know, like, you weren't being a strong enough team player because you weren't honest in that meeting, kind of thing. And you're like, what are you talking about, Luke? I just gave you the report, kind of thing. And that's me saying, look, I'm making a value judgment against you that not only I can hold against you, but others can hold against you as well, because you're not being a team player and you're not honoring our values. And it's really hard to respond to things like that unless we go, well, where's the space to have the conversation about what our values really mean and how we display them both internally as a team and how they're displayed across the organization. And again, that's really the job of senior leadership, to enable those things to happen. The problem is, if your senior leaders aren't displaying those values, then everyone knows that they're just tokenistic.
Yeah. Because I've been in a few situations myself where I've given open feedback and spoken my mind, but then they've held it against me, or I've been punished for it. And then they say, well, how come you're not speaking up anywhere in meetings? Because if I didn't see anything get done as a result of my feedback, I know that they're not listening. So I'm not going to continue giving feedback because it's to my detriment.
And then we go back to our silos. We go back to our inaction as a form of action because of it. So I think, again, it's, well, what's the trust? Is it in the values? Is it in the person? Is it in the relationships? And this is where, having that kind of systems approach, I'm always looking for interconnections as opposed to, right, you've told me your values, that's great. It's about going, right, how do those values link to the way in which leaders behave, how those leaders lead, and what's the benefit that's being brought about by displaying those values?
So if you were to go into an organization with a fresh pair of eyes, and let's say this organization's been struggling to keep their team motivated and they're not meeting their targets, what are some of the first things that you would look for to make improvements as a consultant coming in? How would you structure, what would you focus on?
First of all, you need to know what's going on with the team. You know, is it that there's not enough trust in the team, that there's not enough interaction with the team? Because is the result based on the team achieving or individuals in the team achieving? If it's individuals in the team, then we're not a team, are we? So you have to work out, right, what are the perspectives in there? And then I'm always interested in, like, where are boundaries in things? So where's the bits where people say they can't do something? So I can't talk to you because, you know, we've been told we can only email, you know, like, and then, like, where did that come about? Is that in policy? Is that in culture? So, like, I like pushing boundaries immensely to be able to understand if something's not working, somebody's kind of said something can't be done. And is that in their head, or is that explicit? Is that cultural? So again, it's always, for me, it's always starting with, like, where are people at? And then how did we get here? So was the team high performing in the past and things have dipped? Have we never come together? So, like, asking them to change once that ritual of interaction has started to become apparent, it's going to be really hard. So again, but there's boundaries in there. So it's always like, explore with people, find the boundaries, then play with the boundaries.
Let's talk about high performing teams again, like the dynamics of a high performing team. What do you think about having a diverse team with different skill sets, different cultures? Because you hear that a lot. Like, to make a good team, we can't have a team of individuals who are all the same and have the same skill sets. It needs to be a diverse set of skills or multicultural. Is that really what you need to make a high performing team, or is that something more related to having that diversity and inclusion that you see a lot in organizations now?
I think I'd start one step back and go, look at your recruitment process for the team. So are people recruiting in a self-similar way? So yes, we want a diverse team, but the actual recruitment process creates people who look very similar, sound very similar, think very similar to me. So you're never, like, if your pool of diversity is very narrow going in, it's going to be even narrower trying to set that team up because you haven't got enough choice, kind of thing. So I think there's that aspect. And I think within teams, the diversity aspect is probably diversity in ways of thinking that matters most, actually. And to get that diversity in ways of thinking, then you do need to go, right, do we have people from different backgrounds? Do we have people with different lived experiences? Do we have people who are willing to explore things in alternative ways and recognize that that may produce conflict? And if it produces conflict, how does that team go about resolving it? That's where you get the best. So simply doing like tokenistic things by going like, oh, we need more people of color and we need more women. But if they're all coming from like elite private schools, you're not getting more diversity of thinking. Yeah. You're just getting more representation of difference in the room.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where it's really crucial to say like the two things need to be really tangibly linked. So if we want more people of color in the room, are we recruiting from a wider pool kind of thing, or, rather than just this particular university?
Yeah. I agree. I think it's more like having diversity of thought rather than diversity of race or background sort of thing to hit certain equity or inclusion numbers, because that doesn't really build a high performing team, right?
It doesn't build a high performing team because your target is distorting the benefit you're seeking to achieve. So can we just like, are we just tick boxing? Like, can we get enough of this percentage of people in? And you see this across loads of organizations, like we're not recruiting enough women, people with abilities. And the reason you're not is because is your system actually inducive for those people to want to be there as well? So yes, we can say we want these things, but what does the system actually or organization actually do to say we welcome that as well, rather than, well, we've got a 2% increase in people of color joining this organization, but then look at your retention level. Are you losing 1.5 of them every year because they're not staying around? So you value diversity in symbol, but not in substance.
Yeah. And it has to be a representative sample of the talent that's out there as well, because sometimes you could be trying to recruit for certain genders or certain races, but if that talent pool is limited, it means you're basically taking on anyone that meets that criteria rather than the best across the board.
I think it's about where the talent lies. And this goes back to our point about, are we talking about qualifications or are we talking about skills and capabilities? And so, like, to give an example, when I meet, people in the youth prison and the adult prison, like I see fantastic business brains at play. And I just think wrong moment, wrong path sometimes. And when they leave here, the expectations of the jobs they can get are really low, partly because there's a label on them, but partly because their own confidence is like, who's going to value me? And yet, like, I always remember talking to one young man who was like, I was like, man, you should be in recruitment, because he can spot people's weaknesses in interviews or personalities very quickly. And I said, like, have you ever thought about becoming a recruiter? Never even heard of the job. Never even knew it existed, like that ability to psychoanalyze someone really quickly and work out what they would be good at doing. And I was like, right, there's the disconnect between the talent and where employees go searching for that talent.
Yeah. You mentioned that diversity of thought can create conflict, and I think conflict can be a superpower in itself. How would you turn conflict into something that's valuable?
I think, firstly, it's about articulating what the conflict is. So people tend to do two things. They either tend to personalize really quickly. So it's about me and you, or I get emotional and I go, I can't believe you made me feel this way today, kind of thing. Neither of those things is talking about the conflict. So what is the conflict that's actually happening between us? And sometimes there's a danger that we treat the objects of the conflict as the conflict itself. So I always remember talking to this leader in an organization. He was like, oh, two of my managers are arguing about a parking place, like who gets to park there. I was like, do you really think that's what the conflict's about? Or do you think it's actually about the fact that neither one of them feels respected by the other? Because they could find a solution to it. It's like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about it that way before. I've just been thinking about how to allocate a different car parking space to each one. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So it's like, well, what is the conflict that's happening at the relational level that needs to be addressed? And then if you can understand that, you can get people into space to articulate their conflicts. I think that's absolutely crucial without, and this is the important point, without weaponizing it. So without going, right, I'm going to take you to HR on this one, or I'm going to take this up to senior leadership, because if the conflict's between us, how can we find a safe space to have that conversation about what's actually happening? Because when we do that, I think people can move from conflict immersion into conflict transformation. So how can we transform this conflict? And that goes to your true point, which is there's the benefit. The creative way in which we can think our ways out of conflict could have a benefit not just to the two of us, but to our teams, to the way we work, and therefore reinforce a positive culture.
Yeah. Let's quickly touch upon like change management, because I think change is inevitable in any organization or in life if you want a transformation of some sort. And I've been in situations where I got sent to Norway on an international assignment. I was specifically there to make like process improvements, and this is to improve process for people that have been working in that role for maybe the past 20 years, right? So I'm just there to automate things, make things more efficient. And I was a graduate at the time, so I came in, really energetic, trying to make a difference. And I remember I was just sitting down with these people and going through their processes, mapping out the process to see how I can make improvements. And I didn't really think about how this could impact their role, because I could be potentially eliminating their role. So at that point, I didn't have the confidence to think like, this is what I'm doing. I did come to notice it like a few months into the role that, okay, I need to bring them along the journey with me and show them how they can do higher value activities instead of maybe some of the autonomous tasks that they're doing at the moment. What are your thoughts for people trying to implement change? Like, what are the best practices to go about managing change?
I think this sounds really obvious, but like recognition that change is always happening. And we tend to forget that because in the way in which things are reported to us, the way in which things are described to us sometimes, that everything sounds like it's static, whereas actually there's dynamics in play continuously. Like even to maintain the status quo can be super hard for organizations sometimes because they're fighting against, innovation, competition, changes in customer behavior, but we're still going to keep doing like that. Takes a lot of effort sometimes to maintain the status quo. And that's where you get this kind of system pushback that, we're going to be resistant to the change because we're comfortable now. And I think this is where there is one of the things that I think really is crucial to kind of like complex systems is recognizing if your environment changes, the system has to adapt. Whereas we tend to talk about markets, customer bases, clients, the public as static things, as objects, rather than dynamic and evolving. So the conversation about Generation Z, that is a movement in society that's happening. How do organizations respond to that? Well, you're going to need to change something probably internally. So I think recognizing that change is always there is important. I think, again, it goes to this point around stakeholder engagement. The biggest risk is thinking, I know best, so I can just change an organization and tell everyone to do it. What feedback have I had that that's the right way to do it? And so what are the ways in which information flows into the organization and is valued as well is really crucial. I remember asking a group of senior leaders once, if I've got the most innovative idea in this organization, how would you make it happen? And everyone said, do you go to golf with the CEO? Like that's how, like if you're doing that, you'll get his ear or her ear and that would change it. But otherwise, it's not happening because the system itself filters it out so that you don't get that change. You get that resistance to change and that pushback to change all the time. So I think it's about recognizing that both change is natural and pushback to change is natural as well. But if we're thinking about it at a systems level, I'm not interested in the intervention, deliverable, or component. I'm interested in the interconnections that will occur because of that change happening. And then you have to think through what are the system indicators that tell you that change is happening. I have to resist constantly the language of outputs and outcomes because that's the language of interventions. Whereas if we're thinking about systems indicators, what is the things that will change over the longer term? So that's going to be things around culture. That's going to be things around narrative. That's going to be things around behavior. And those things often do take a lot longer. So you have to have an eye to not just what's happening now, but what's going to happen if the system is truly starting to change.
So
does any of this resonate with you? Do you have a toxic boss? Do you feel like your organization is set up for high performance? Up next, we have the final episode of this 3-part series, which is focusing on systems for societal change. How can we reduce conflict? How can we have peace in our communities? How can we become better parents and in general, better members of society? Click here to watch this episode.